It's time for muffins. What we're going to do is actually, this activity is a combination of two different labs that were in your lab manual. So the first lab was the effect of flour type on cake, where you had 5 different types of flour, but everything else was the same. So you could see the difference in texture, crumb, which is the internal structure and texture, the difference in the height and flavor, and all different kinds of aspects. So you compare the different types of flour on different types of cake. There was also a lab that involved making cranberry muffins. And those muffins used different, it was comparing liquid fat, in this case vegetable oil, to solid fat or vegetable shortening. And the idea is that the vegetable shortening, the solid fat, would have, the end result for the muffins would be more like a biscuit or a scone, typically, compared to the liquid fat. What I did for the first time ever was try to combine those two activities into one. So basically we're going to cream the sugar first. Solid fat, liquid fat. So we have two bases. From here, we're going to make a muffin with all-purpose flour, a muffin with cake flour, and a muffin with whole wheat flour. And then we're going to repeat the same process with a muffin of all-purpose flour, cake flour, and whole wheat flour, just with the liquid fat or vegetable oil. So the first thing that I'm going to do is get our wet ingredients mixed. I'm going to cream the sugar first. So I have my mixer over here, and I'm going to add in the milk, 4 ounces of milk, 2 ounces of vegetable oil, 1 egg, and this is a half teaspoon of salt, and then 4 ounces of sugar. So the bases between the two are the same except for the fat source. I'd say that looks pretty good. That's pretty well mixed. So you want to make sure that your sugar is dissolved into the fat. We have our salt, our eggs are broken up and evenly dispersed. So that you can make sure it's well mixed. What you want to avoid is over mixing of the flour, the dry ingredient, because if you over mix the flour as we add it, you'll see that too much, just like with the bread, which when we were kneading the dough, we wanted that gluten to form. With muffins, we don't want to overproduce gluten, because if there's too much gluten, it's going to resist the expansion. It's going to resist that rising process, which just reminded me that I don't have any baking soda out here. Well, actually, this recipe calls for baking powder, so I'm going to get some, because without that, we have nothing. All right, so I'll be right back. I have the double-acting baking powder, which I almost forgot to put in. Without this, our product would not have risen. Baking powder is our leavening agent for this recipe. So leavening agents, like the yeast in our bread recipe, release carbon dioxide. The yeast do it through respiration, a metabolic process. The baking powder does it chemically. So it's double acting, which means when it gets wet, it releases CO2, and also when it's exposed to heat, it releases CO2. So our leavening, the thing that's going to give us a light, airy texture, is going to be baking powder. The difference between baking powder and baking soda is baking soda is sodium bicarbonate. An easy way for me to remember that is sodium bicarbonate, SB, is baking soda, BS. So they have the same letters, where baking powder contains sodium bicarbonate, but it also has an acid added to it. That's the difference. So what we're going to do, we're going to put in 2 teaspoons. Now normally this would go into the dry ingredients, but being that I am using this base to make 3 different types of muffins, I'm going to put it in the wet ingredients and then just mix it up quickly. Put it right here so I remember to use it. I'm just going to give it a quick mix. Okay. So now we have our base with the vegetable oil, and we are going to make an all-purpose flour muffin, a cake flour muffin, and a whole wheat flour muffin. So we have our 3 different types of flour. So I'm going to put this into a measuring cup to see how much of it we have. We're going to make sure that we get everything out. Okay. Set that aside. So I'd say we have 9, it's actually almost exactly 9 ounces. What are the chances of that? This is the egg and fat base that I need to divide up into 3 to make the 3 different oil-based muffin recipes or batters. So 9 ounces. And then the last 3 ounces. So I have my muffin pan already greased and marked. So I have oil, all-purpose, oil, cake, oil, whole wheat. Then shortening, all-purpose, shortening cake, shortening whole wheat. So I am going to start with, I'm just going to move these aside so that I know where I'm at and I don't get confused. So I have all-purpose oil. So I'm going to take my 2 ounces of flour. Now I don't want to overmix this, so let's see how this works if I just do it by hand. Next we're going to the cake flour in the oil. Again, that's 2 ounces. I'm mixing it by hand so that I'm not over-forming the gluten, which in order of the presence or the amount of gluten in each type of flour that we're working with, whole wheat would have the most gluten. All-purpose would be somewhere in the middle. And cake flour would have the least amount of gluten, which is why you use cake flour for cakes, because you want that light, airy, nice sponge type texture with the cake. So here are our 3, I don't want to tilt it too much, oil-based cupcakes. We have the all-purpose flour, the cake flour, and the whole wheat flour. So now we're going to just repeat this entire process with the shortening. I could almost cut this with the spatula. Get it in there. See the difference in the consistency? It didn't pour out. I can spoon it out. Okay, so this side is shortening. This side is vegetable oil. This row is whole wheat flour. This row is cake flour. And this row is all-purpose flour. I'm going to get these in the oven. It's set at 400 degrees. And it'll probably take somewhere around 20 minutes. So, I'll see you soon. Okay, are we ready for the moment of truth with the muffins? Here we have our muffin tin. You can see that this side is the shortening. We have all-purpose flour, cake flour, and then whole wheat flour. And on this side we have oil with all-purpose flour. We have oil, cake flour, and vegetable oil, whole wheat flour. So right off the bat, I guess you could say the biggest difference amongst all of them would be the whole wheat flours look more different than the others, with the whole wheat shortening one looking the most different. And I would say that the shortening has a lot to do with that, along with the whole wheat flour, being that it takes it absorbs more of the moisture, and with the solid fat, it really gives it more of a biscuit-like texture. So what I'm going to do is cut all of them open. So we are going to start with the all-purpose shortening. And it looks to have a nice even crumb, even texture. So it's all-purpose shortening. And I'm going to cut the all-purpose vegetable oil. Right off the bat, and looking at both of them, the oil seems to have a lighter texture to it. Okay, so the all-purpose flour, we'll do a taste comparison. It has a light, even crumb. And I would say, just as you could see visually, you could feel the textural difference between the two, with the shortening being more coarse. Next up, we have the cake flour with the oil and the cake flour with the shortening. Up top, they look about the same. So typically with cake flour, you're going to have less gluten, so you'll have a smaller, smoother crumb, which I guess you could say is evident on the oil side, and then less so, but it's pretty even on the right side. I'd say cake flour is probably the best choice for these muffins without even tasting them, just looking at the texture. Now, in terms of taste, let's give them a shot. Very light, it almost disappears to the point that I just felt like the flour was gone, the dough was gone, and what was left was the cranberries. So let's try the cake flour with the shortening. Similar feeling. What I would say is it's still light, but it crumbles apart. I could feel it crumble in my mouth, where the oil in the cake flour, it kind of melted away, but it stayed smooth. Where the shortening in the cake flour, it kind of still disappeared as soon as I put it in my mouth, but I could feel it crumble apart. So the shortening seems to, again, be more coarse and kind of crumble apart easier. Our last comparison we have is the whole wheat flour, and these probably look the most different out of all of them. So here we have the vegetable oil, and here is the shortening. Cut it in half. And it looks pretty coarse. And again, the color is a lot different than the others. The crumb factor here, this is definitely more like it's almost like a scone or a biscuit. The one that's the shortening whole wheat is more like a biscuit. Okay, so here we go. It's time for the taste test. This is whole wheat flour with vegetable oil. It is interesting. I would say the whole wheat imparts a flavor that is definitely different than the other two. It stands out. I can definitely taste the whole wheat. Let me try the whole wheat flour with the shortening. So, whole wheat flour with the shortening, to me, is very dry. It's the driest out of all of them by far. And we discussed some of the factors that could influence that texture and the dryness of the product. So, and again, the whole wheat really imparts a flavor that is not desirable when you're thinking in terms of a muffin, especially like a cranberry muffin, like a light fruit flavored muffin. If I had to say overall what I think would be the best in terms of making this muffin, I could tell you hands down the worst is the whole wheat flour. You do not want to use whole wheat flour when you're making muffins. Cake flour was very light, but it almost seemed like it couldn't stand up to the cranberries. So I think cake flour overall would be best for cupcakes. That kind of texture, that kind of product would be better suited for cake flour, I believe. So to me, based on tasting them just now, I would say the best texture, moisture content, mouthfeel, flavor overall, the best experience, considering all the criteria, would probably have to be the all-purpose flour with the vegetable oil. The all-purpose flour with the shortening was very close, of course. So if you needed to make that substitution to vegetable oil, vegetable shortening, it probably wouldn't be that big of a deal. It'd be interesting to see vegetable oil versus a substitution that someone would probably be more likely to make for nutritional reasons, such as like a coconut oil. So some other oil that's solid at room temperature instead of vegetable shortening, which is just vegetable oil that's been processed to be solid at room temperature. So again, unless you were there was a cost savings if you were scaling this up to use shortening, and again, without looking at like a coconut oil or something else, I would probably say the most desirable is the vegetable oil all-purpose. So with that, that's the end of this lab.